Recording. Hello from Switzerland. Hello, Rebecca. Okay, great. So we're here. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope you enjoyed the chit chat. Becky and John, you guys are so sweet, really. I just love to see your faces. Watching John balance Jenga yesterday was something special. It's really nice to see everybody. Thank you for joining us for our session today with Dr. Stephen Porges. I am over the moon excited to welcome him here with us today. I'm just going to say a little bit about Stephen's background for those who aren't familiar. He's the author of the Polyvagal Theory, Neurophysiological Foundations of Emotions, Attachment, Communication, and Self-Regulation. He's the Distinguished University Scientist at Indiana University, where he's the founding director of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium. He first published on the polyvagal theory back in 1994, and it's since become a crucial part of our understanding of trauma and trauma recovery. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our dialogue.
Yeah, I'm really curious to hear from you, Stephen, if you don't mind sharing just at the outset, because I've read many times that you never anticipated polyvagal theory to do what it's been doing in the world, and I'm so curious to know what that's been like for you.
Well, I would tell you that I'm about at the edge of what I can handle. So it's a very peculiar bit. Polyvagal theory was written up in a David Brooks article in the New York Times, and a friend was over and saying, how did it feel to be in the article? I said, well, it's double-edged. It's nice to know that it's becoming part of the consciousness of popular culture or society. But I don't want to be a public person. I appreciate the accessibility that I have being a private person. And I think we forget about that. So we want to be able to give to the world, but we want to be able to give to the world without having to blast our name as a banner. So we want it embedded. And actually, in my perspective, what I decided to do was to try to enable a concept that I would call polyvagal informed, so that people could, in a sense, take that into their own practices and their own treatment models and view them as polyvagal informed. And my name could kind of like slip out of it and not be there. So I appreciate being acknowledged. Remember, I'm a human, I'm an academic, but we also start to respect how important it is to be an accessible human being.
To be accessible and inaccessible, did you say?
No, be an accessible human being.
Be an accessible human being.
Yeah, because it's very special when people can come up to you and say, you know, your work has changed my life, and they can feel comfortable in coming up. But if you become too much of a public person, there's this boundary that's put up, and then you actually have handlers that get in the way and block the accessibility to people. So the issue is, actually, let's rewind a little bit to your real question. I was really shocked that it was so embraced by the trauma world. And that was really my the venue, because the trauma world understood what I talked about. I talked about our physiology shifting states under threat and under safety, and under really life threat being very special. And that the physiology changed, and once that physiology changed, then the emergent properties of our mental health and our behavior changed. And this really was the narrative of many, many trauma survivors. And so it gave them a type of validity. Now, you have to understand that the theory was developed before I was trauma informed. So it became almost this paradox. My eyes are now popping wide open, and I'm hearing what people are telling me. I actually developed the theory when I was working with autistic individuals and the physiological state. And the theory is not even derived from that. The theory was derived from my work in obstetrics and neonatology, where babies under certain conditions go into massive bradycardias and apneas, meaning their heart rates drop so much and they stop breathing that they are, in a sense, in a lethal state. And I was always trying to figure out the mechanisms and the triggers of that. And in a way, you start seeing all these features, whether it's the newborn baby going into an apneic episode, or the autistic individual protecting themselves or shutting down. you see the same mechanisms being played out in a trauma survivor's narrative in their life. So polyvagal theory was welcome because it made sense of the experience. And what I'd like to say now, 25 years post-theory, is that the theory gives the clinical sciences or clinical disciplines, it enables them to deal with clients to shift the narrative from events to personal experiences and feelings. So even in the world today where we start looking at ACEs, we are basically stuck in the spreadsheet model of checklists of defining PTSD. But that's not the real experience of people. Some people have severe biological shifts and feelings to situations that are trivial to others. And others can go through the most horrendous experiences, come out on the other end and said, I'm fine. And the mistake we make is to think that we are like everyone else. There's great variability, and that requires a respect and a capacity to accurately witness another person's feelings. And that's what polyvagal theory brings to the fore. It says it's not functionally a psychological experience, it's a whole body experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really been such a gift. And I'm wondering if you could tell us, because I think there are people on this call who are more familiar with polyvagal theory and there are people who are not. So as not to spend the whole hour describing what is, you could probably...
Are you asking me my least favorite question?
Yes, I am. Just a very, very, very brief summary of what we're talking about when it comes to polyvagal theory and trauma.
Well, let's just start off by saying that polyvagal theory emphasizes that our physiological state, the state our body is a major determinant of how we react to the world. So that if our body is highly mobilized and our heart's beating fast, we're likely to detect the world as being aggressive and hurtful. We'll become defensive on that. But if our body goes into kind of a shutting down reaction, we dissociate, we become removed from the world. Now, the part of all this is that the theory is bidirectional, meaning that our thoughts can influence our physiology, but our physiology could influence our thoughts. And that's why it's very important in a therapeutic journey to understand that you need both directions. So the point is that our nervous system detects certain cues in the environment as being safe. Potentially, the major ones happen to be intonation of voice, gesture, facial expressivity, especially the upper part of the face. And these features calm the other person's nervous system. So that polyvagal theory is a theory of co-regulation. What is it that our body is looking for to feel safe? And what does our body react to when it's triggered into defenses? Polyvagal theory articulated something different, though. It said that we have two basic defense strategies. One that everyone is familiar with and was dominating the clinical world and creating a problem to the survivors of trauma. The polyvagal theory says, of course, there's the fight-flight response, but you forgot that there's a more ancient shutdown response of withdrawal, and where the physiology just stops, literally. It's linked in other mammals to death feigning, and it's basically an older evolutionary script that comes from reptiles, because one of the major defense programs in behavior and physiology is a reptile that basically appears not to move, not to breathe, and not to be alive. And when you talk to survivors of trauma, they have a history in which they had got into that, but their body is too smart. Their body says to them that if you go into this state, you could die because you're not getting enough oxygenated blood. But if you just dissociate, you're going to be safer. So we kind of take this death feigning response and we modify it to become dissociative. So now dissociation is really viewed as a positive adaptive transition for someone who has been in a life-threatening situation. Now remember, different therapeutic strategies will shift the responsibility for the behavior. So meaning that they focus on intentionality. Why did you dissociate? Or why did you get scared? Or why are you depressed? Why are you anxious? Polyvagal theory says that's not the way of approaching it. Your body is going into these states without awareness. And it's not an intentionality, but you can be aware of the response. And through that awareness or embodiment of our own physiological shifts, we can start learning what behaviors will emerge, will come out of it. Then we can treat our body in a different way. So let's say that your body is, your heart's beating fast, you can feel that you're tightening up. Is this the time to engage a person on a very serious emotional discussion? What you don't realize, or what most people don't realize, is not only is your body tensed up, but you're sending cues to the other person that you are hostile, that you're not welcoming, and that you're not a good witness. So the issue is, not only do we react, but we mirror in a reflexive way. And we're unaware of the cues that trigger us, but we're always aware of how we feel.
And this is really a very empowering situation, isn't it? Because you use the word polyvagal informed, or the term. So if learning about our own physiology and learning about the states that the various states and how they manifest in our bodies is very empowering, because then like you said, we can actually choose when to engage or when not to engage, or be able to read potentially in another person's physiology, what might be going on.
And read in ourselves.
Yeah.
Because our natural strategy is to place the attribution on the other person. So I often say, why do we ever argue? Because we can't win an argument. You just don't win, because what you're doing is triggering each other. So it's a perfect example of dysregulation is an argument. Ruptures are common in all relationships, but ruptures are really opportunities for repair. And repairs are using this positive attributes of engagement. But polyvagal theory talks about a whole system that's called the social engagement system. And this evolved in mammals that links the nerves that regulate the facial muscles with the vagal regulation of the heart. So in many ways, we project our heart in our face and in our voice. Just think about that. But you see, intuitively, we already know that. So people will always say, why are you looking that way? Or what's wrong? Your voice is lacking the intonation and prosody. So we came into the world wired to detect certain features. And those features are linked to how we regulate our autonomic nervous system. And whether the features help support the autonomic nervous system in its functioning of homeostatic, biologically beneficial processing, or does it shift that system into states of defense that supports mobilization or withdrawal, death feigning?
There's another response that a lot of people talk about now, or lately, called the fawn or the tend befriend response, which is interesting because it seems to add some nuance into this.
Yeah.
Which is, I wonder if you could speak to that.
I think I was asked only a couple months ago for the first time, what about appeasement?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I think that's really where you're going. Mm-hmm. And I said, I hadn't really thought about it. And then a good friend of mine works with women who have been abducted for many years and have been accused of the Stockholm syndrome and are livid. They're really angry because they don't like the person. They really despise the person, but they survived. So the argument was, why didn't you run away? Why didn't you do that? And the answer is they had a certain type of resilience. And this is what I want to emphasize. They were able to use their social engagement system in a convincing way to trigger safety in the predator. That is really remarkable, because they were able to, in a sense, understand the complexity of the situation and also their vulnerability, and to override it with the nuance of this social engagement system. So to me, it's remarkable that they were able to do this. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard someone, a teacher of mine actually recently saying as well that it could be that when there was some kind of threat, let's say to a tribe or a village, that often the women would be the ones that would have this response. And this was a very, beneficial response for the village. They could get the children together. They could gather resources.
Let's think about this whole, okay, tend and befriend, but let's talk about appeasement. And let's ask this question about what happened to those who were unable to appease? You see, so they're probably not with us today. So we're not talking about a capacity that everyone seems to have. So we're talking about a very select group of people who have been able to, in a sense, keep in their visualization hope. That's what they were telling me when I talked to them. Hope for their children. So they could keep this mental image and function. And when I asked one of them how the predator responded, the predator would say that this person's very optimistic and, you know, had a lot of energy. And so you get, in a sense, the effectiveness of this presentation. So there's one, and we're talking in the trauma world, where people have this capacity and flexibility to appease. And I don't consider that a general trait or characteristic that everyone can do. And I wouldn't, if we start to talk that way, we get into the shame and blame even more. It just, by a quirk of individual differences in the nervous system, this person had that resilience. We make mistakes about talking about courage and being courageous when the courage and really is an emergent property of that physiological state. So in a sense, it's in background, it's not in foreground. The courage is coming from the wiring of that nervous system not to go into states of terror. And that's wonderful. Now there's some training that can go with it, like the military does some of that, especially with their special forces. But what they do is they get rid of the terror by creating very strong bonds between the special forces teams. So like with Navy SEALs, part of the initiation or training is the person is functionally drowns and is resuscitated. So their body goes through the shutting down, but now they're in the arms of someone who's supporting them.
Really?
Yeah, so it's a very profound and sophisticated neurophysiological retuning to the connectedness of that team. Yet those same people are not that connected to their families.
Wow.
So there's a lot of, you know, abuse and violence within their families, but with their team, they're safe. So it's this retuning of a system and retuning the system to know where it's safe or to feel safe.
To feel safe.
Yeah. The issue of women having the special roles in history tends to be really it will be probably true. And part of it has to do with we're kind of wired for a maternal lullaby. I mean, that's kind of what we come into the world with. We come into the world wanting to hear intonations of vocalizations that are female-like, very much like a mother talking to her newborn or young one. Fathers have come into the world with a disadvantage in regulating their children because their voices are lower and often more monotonic. And so they often are extremely frustrated. You can see this manifested again in families of autistic children, where the children are often afraid of their father's voice. It's telling you exactly what's going on. And you also can see this generation of this bias towards female vocalizations in the classical music composers. So Mozart basically starts his symphonies with a mother's lullaby. It's, you know, it's very melodic, it's in the same range. And then through the familiarity and the predictability of the melody, the frequency band is expanded when the music is played by instruments of lower and higher frequencies. But our voices are ways in which we project to another that we're safe to come close to. And in our society, we forget it's much more important how we say things than what we say.
How we say things,
How we say things. The interesting part is you can have close friends that you don't like their political viewpoints. You don't like anything that they believe in, but you like them.
Yeah.
And people get confused. And so the issue is, it's because they're able to regulate your physiology through their voice and through their gestures.
So it's some of the features of this social engagement system are things like, you said, the voice, so the prosody, the range of tone in the voice that a person is speaking. But there's a lot here with the eyes, with the mouth, Can you say a
Well,
little bit more about that?
the interesting part is the upper face that's
Mm-hmm.
wired so much into the system because the lower part of the face controls your jaw and your teeth, and that's part of our aggressiveness. So what you find out is that when people don't use the upper part of their face, the lower part of the face becomes more empowered. And you can see this in autistic kids, even the EMG, the muscle tension being measured, is greater in the lower part of the face, not the uppers. And when you ask a severely autistic individual to smile, it's way down here. It's not this exuberance up high. So our nervous system is looking around the eyes. And we kept on thinking it's eye contact. Well, it's actually scanning for cues about that muscle. That's the synergism. The other interesting part is that the nerves that regulate the orbital muscle around the eye are linked to the nerves that regulate muscles in our middle ear, meaning that if we feel safe and we make this eye contact, the muscles in the middle ear contract, and now we can extract human voice better from background sounds. So now you see that kids with autism have flat faces, individuals with depression or PTSD, flat upper faces, and they all have auditory hypersensitivities because
They have
it's part of that same system. The body is shifted state to be defensive, and when you have auditory hypersensitivities, you have an advantage of detecting lower frequency predator-related sounds.
and it can be harder to distinguish human voices from
right.
from the range
Well,
of sound.
it's not just hard to distinguish. The human voice gets buried. People aren't even hearing it. They may know that someone's speaking, but they can't extract the ends of the words. So everything kind of blurs, because to get the ends of the words, the consonants have higher harmonic frequencies. And when our middle ear muscles are tuned to detect predator sounds, those sounds are totally masked. We can't get them.
Stephen, one of your, of course, one aspect of your theory that's quite important for people is this concept of neuroception, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Would you like to tell us a little bit? I mean, because I have a specific question about neuroception that's not just the basic question, and maybe I can start with that, and you can answer the question as you talk about it. But you hear often people talk about intuition.
Yeah.
They might say something like, I don't know, I just got this bad feeling about the person. And then there's this jump from the embodied feeling that something's weird with this person to an interpretation of that person being bad in some way. And I'm wondering if you could talk about the distinction between neuroception, maybe faulty neuroception, and intuition.
Well, I think they're greatly overlapping. See, the intuition is that our body reacted, and we just don't know why it reacted. And that could very well be neuroception. So let's go back to where neuroception came from. So I needed, when developing the theory, I had all these different physiological states that were linked to one being safe and social and interactive, one being mobilized in fight flight, and one being shutting down. But I needed a mechanism to get the person into those states. And I started to think about what is the word that I wanted to use. I initially thought, well, we're really talking about a perceived threat or perceived this. And I said, no, that's not right, because perception implies a degree of cognitive awareness. And if we were a species that required cognitive awareness to react to situation, we would not be a species anymore. We would just not evolve. We would be gone. So the examples I start to think about is like a gunshot or someone hitting the brakes or someone screaming. And our bodies detect that long before we know what we've detected, or we'll stop and try to attend to it. So they become triggers of an event, and it occurs so rapidly that it can't be perception. But it doesn't mean, if it's not cognitive, it doesn't mean that your cortex isn't involved in it. So we get kind of confused in our cortical-centric, cognitive-centric world. We think that we have to be aware of everything that our higher brain is doing. Neuroception says we're using high-level parts of our brain, but they're not in awareness. It's just other circuits, and they're going to work very rapidly on a conservative level. They're going to try to keep us alive. So they're going to shift our physiological state to enhance the detection of risk. Now, that's what the system evolved to do. But now when you have someone who is a survivor of trauma, their system is now totally retuned to be on the conservative level. So let me give you an example. A survivor of trauma, if a woman is a survivor of trauma and she says, I've survived serious trauma, I'd like you to lead me to a clinical treatment model. And I look and I say, would you like a hug? It's not going to work because the proximity is going to be a trigger, especially a male. So you start understanding that and this is very important to people who are trying to establish relationships where they may really like the other person, but when they go into an embrace, their body pulls back. That's neuroception. And so it's not intention, it's that the body detects cues, and it may be faulty cues. So this is the part where we want to get to, that if you have experienced severe trauma, the body will retune itself to go into both mobilized defense or fight flight or shutting down. So it's going to try to it's just not going to be safe with another person. So the trauma history even means that if someone is doing intonation with a lot of prosodic voice, the body may start feeling relaxed for a moment and then go into this great defense. So it's because the underlying cues of the nervous system are, yes, this is safe, but now the association in the brain is when I was safe last, I was violated. So its violation of trust becomes a major part that the nervous system has retained.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was going to say that in the world of attachment theory, and I was at a conference in November in London on attachment and trauma, and I was actually leading a panel discussion, and I said to one person, I said, why do you even use the word attachment? Is it a necessary term? Of course, the person and several others got very upset because that's how they organized their views of the world. But what I was really saying, couldn't you replace it with trust? And aren't you really talking about violation of trust? And now we've moved closer to the process upon which attachment theory is built, especially in the world of trauma. So our nervous systems want to be safe in proximity of another person. We want to co-regulate and connect. But if those cues from the other now trigger defense, we are in trouble. We can't co-regulate. We're in constant hypervigilant states. And this is really saying that the system is just not safe with another.
And so how do we start to move out of that, especially when, this is what's interesting to me, especially for the person who's experienced trauma, is that they exhibit, they can't, and this is, I know, part of their protection, their self-protection, but they can push connection away, which can, of course, invite more of this, of what they're already expecting, this disconnection between them and others. And how do you then start to move beyond that? That's, I guess, the question. How do you begin to invite in those cues of safety or?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is, okay, those are the real questions of therapy. But if we sit back and we kind of observe both successful therapists and successful therapeutic models, they all have something in common. They have the common point is that they are teaching people or allowing people. We got to be careful about the word teach, because teaching requires evaluation, and then we start feeling bad about ourselves. So the therapeutic model is an enabler. It allows the person to feel their body. Now remember, another part of trauma is numbness. So they're feeling their body. Now the question is, once they feel their body, the body can go into these various states. It can go into these defenses, it can go into including dissociative and withdrawal. But part of the therapeutic model is now the experience, again, using the word embodiment of that feeling and the narrative that goes with it. So now we start recruiting a top-down regulation of bottom-up feelings. And I think therapies are all about that. They're all about experiencing the body and then allowing the body to resolve it, meaning don't overwhelm it. You see, what we tend to think, if something is working, we need to do more of it. And in many aspects of trauma treatment, less is probably going to be more effective because it's going to be less disruptive or triggering of the nervous system to go in states of defense. So we can allow the nervous system to resolve that feeling, to be comfortable with it before we move on.
Thank you, Stephen. There are a lot of comments making. I'm wondering if we might want to open up to some other people the possibility to ask a few questions, because we have so many comments in here, which is fantastic.
Sure, I'm fine with that.
Does anybody would anybody like to ask a question for Stephen?
So we have someone here who's got their hand raised. I can unmute them. Hi there, R. You're unmuted.
Are you there? No. Okay, Jessica has a question. Would you like to ask a question, Jessica? Yes. You can write it in here, or you can raise your hand. Go ahead. Jessica's asking you about your view on sleep training for children. So are you referring to cry it out methods, Jessica? Yes, she is.
Okay. That would not be consistent with the polyvagal informed strategy, because what that is saying that you're going to sleep through exhaustion and withdrawal from interaction. A crying baby in general is the two sources, either the child's in pain, which does occur with especially gastric pain, and the other one is being separated because the child, as well as the adult, we didn't evolve to be self-regulators all the time. We evolved to be co-regulated, and that co-regulation provides the resilience. It's an exercise of resilience, and it's a neural exercise that enables us to self-regulate. So a crying baby is not the answer. But also remember, there are different types of cries. So a child, it may be part of their vocabulary is to cry to bring the mother or the father into the room. I think we have to listen to the intensity and the intonation of the cry, and we have to be more nuanced in whether we can basically say this is something we should attend to. But in general, young infants, human infants, evolve to be parented. And then through that parenting to develop on their own an initiative to move out, to explore, to use the support of the interaction to explore.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Stephen. Someone else is asking if you could speak a little bit more on the ventral vagal, so the social engagement system, and how it's involved in sympathetic states as well. So ventral vagal and sympathetic, and also ventral vagal dorsal, and what those look like.
Sure. The world we want to be in is a world in which we're safe, and in that world, the ventral vagus, especially with the social engagement system, is functionally coordinating the sympathetics and the dorsal vagus. I mean, coordinating, keeping them out of going into defense. We have to understand that the autonomic nervous system is not merely a defense system. It's part of our enthusiasm and energy system through the sympathetics, and part of a system that supports homeostatic function, digestion through the dorsal vagus. So these systems are extremely important in the normal homeostatic function of our body. And that homeostatic function, that health-related, growth-related function, gets facilitated by the social engagement system, by the ventral vagus. When the ventral vagus is on, let me give you the example, would be like team sports. You're highly mobilized, but you're using social engagement and vocalization to keep it restrained. But if you watch individuals playing, if someone doesn't use their social engagement system effectively, there are often fights. So someone could hit someone in the movement and then walk away. And what the body is really saying is that if you are triggered, if someone hits you, it could be by mistake. But if you look at me and say, can I help you off the ground? I'm fine. The example I love to use is with dogs. If you watch dogs playing, they'll chase each other, and one will catch one by biting the rear foot. But they don't, at that point, the one that's bit turns and looks at the dog who's doing the biting to make sure that they have that face-to-face look. And at that moment, they role reverse, meaning the dog that was bit now then chases the dog. And just basically reciprocal play.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that.
I left one other thing. So that was mobilization, sympathetic and ventral vagus. But we also have moments of intimacy where we talk to each other in a very prosodic voice without looking at them, and our bodies conform to each other. Even when we're talking about the baby, calming the baby. So you're not always making eye contact, but you're using all the gesturing system of the social engagement system to allow the body to immobilize and feel safe in that immobilization. So there's a difference between shutting down and dissociation and shared moments of intimacy.
Yeah, thank you very much. You mentioned dogs, and it made me think about the role that animals play in co-regulation, and how for some people, I think they even feel safer with animals than with people. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that with animals and co-regulation.
I think you're describing the real world. A lot of people co-regulate with what I call an appropriate mammal, which is not a human being, but it's a mammal that they trust. So the dog evolved to be a very trusting partner. And this is very helpful in individuals regulating their bodily states. So this is quite wonderful. And I think the issue is with those people who regulate with a dog or a cat, it's because their bodies had been violated, or trust had been violated with humans. So the proximity or the attempt to regulate with a human is violated. The other part of this is that potentially the appropriate mammal model can be used as a way of physiologically shifting the state of the individual so that they can then engage another human being.
What are some of the ways that we can learn to shift our state? I mean, therapy is one way that we can start to learn about what state we might be in and how different states feel. But is it interesting, or for you, for example, what are some of the things that you do that shift your state? We were talking about what's your medicine in the opening session. So what are the things that maybe enliven or uplift you, or what are the things that calm and settle you? And it was interesting. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would say the most relaxing thing for me is I actually like silence. So I like reduction of stimulation around me. I like to slow up my breath. I like to sit and look at the ocean. So I like calmness. So it's because the world we live in is so tightly wrapped that a lot of people would say, well, what they like to do is play games. They like to mobilize, go ride a bike or play tennis. But my body says to me, time to basically let it relax, give up all that vigilance and all that tension. So I think the tools that we need to give people have to do with, they're relatively simple. They've been around, they've been a part of humanity for millennia. One is breathing. There are different types of breathing techniques, but breathing is a very useful portal because it's a direct wiring into that ventral vagal circuit. So if you exhale slowly, especially if you do it abdominally as well, the ventral vagus starts having potent effects, meaning that it slows up our heart rate. It acts to nullify some of the sympathetic excitation. It also has some anti-inflammatory aspects. So it actually has a calming effect on our whole body. So slow exhalation is a calming method. And if we think about that as the prototype, we then start seeing how it can be applied in different variations. One would be singing, which is slow exhalations. Another is talking. When you extend the durations of your phrases, what are you doing? You're exhaling slowly. We start seeing that lots of people like to be, quote, audited or witnessed, and they're just running off. Let them. they're telling you they're trying to regulate their body. Let them regulate, because there'll be reciprocity if they get calm. And if you say, oh, now it's my turn, you now have shifted what their body was trying to do, and they get defensive. Let them spill it out. Let them relax and see what comes out. So for me, I would say breathing. I like to talk, obviously, so that becomes part of it. And I like silence. I was a musician when I was younger, and a lot of the ideas of polyvagal theory come from my music background. And that was slow exhalation while playing the clarinet. But it wasn't just exhalation, it was listening and shifting the muscle tension to change the intonality by the shifting embouchure. It was a whole exercise of the social engagement system. What we'll find out as we start querying more and more people is that certain types of social interactions are really neural exercises. Certain types of play are neural exercises, as long as they have a reciprocity and a degree of face-to-face.
Thank you. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned playing the clarinet. I also played the clarinet, and now that you mention it, I do remember how I felt when I would play it and the effect that it would have on me, but I had never put that together.
Yeah, well, it's pranayama yoga. It's, I would say, enforced pranayama yoga, because it's all about breath, but it's more than breath. It's about all those striated muscles of the face and head. And that's critical in the area of the brainstem that regulates that ventral vagus. So you're calming your physiological state, and in doing that, you're able to experience a different aspect of life. So I like to always say that through playing music, certain things become less important, and you're able now to appreciate another dimension of life.
Yeah, absolutely. I see there are many hands raised. Mickey, do you want to let a few people ask questions who have their hands raised?
Try to unmute Liz. Liz, you're unmuted.
Liz, are you there?
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Liz. Let's try Heather. Heather, you're unmuted.
Hi, thank you. So in the day of increasing virtual counseling, how would you suggest people do that best? What are the best practices for that? I personally don't like it very much. I try to avoid it as much as possible. And I only do it with clients who I've met with in person for quite a while. And I do mostly work with trauma survivors. So is there any feedback you have on that? Any input on virtual counseling?
Well, I would ask first, are you doing it with the video or without video?
I usually video.
Yeah, so I like to say that video is better than just hearing the voice, but our bodies really look for true face-to-face. I'm watching myself over time, because I've been doing a lot of video, not counseling, but talks. And I'm kind of like evaluating whether or not I can convey who I am in a video. And so the issue is really to make sure that your voice maintains intonation. And it's tough with cameras to make eye contact, because the cameras are in the wrong place. And if we start looking up at the camera like I'm doing now, I start losing my thoughts. So it's not that easy. I think over time, we'll may be able to develop better technology that will enable the camera to be directly behind the screen of where the person's face is. So we can look in their eyes, and they can see us looking in their eyes, and that might be more effective.
Thank you, Heather, for the question. Stephen, someone just asked a question that I went along the lines of a question I had as well, which is H. pylori, and wondering if that can affect the polyvagal response. So neuroception, if it's scanning for safety and danger, can that be internal as well?
Oh yeah, the issue with, well, first of all, polyvagal theory now is moving into the area of pain. Both visceral pain or gut pain, but also now moving into skeletal spinal pain. With the gut pain, it appears that the pain if we think of pain as a prototypical defense reaction, that the body is now in a state of defense, what if gut pain is basically a trigger for our body to do something, but not really necessary at that point? The bottom line is, I think we can turn that signal off by stimulating the social engagement system. And we're actually doing clinical trials on irritable bowel syndrome and a study on gastric pain in individuals with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is the hypermobility syndrome, but a significant percentage of them have severe gastric pain. And the theory is that stimulating the ventral vagus sends a cue to the enteric system and says, you can now do your job. Think about you're not really aware of what your gut is doing until it's something wrong is occurring. So gut pain is, you don't sit around with gut pleasure, but you have gut pain. And that's because it's waiting for the signal that everything is fine. And part of that signal is coming from the ventral vagus. So we've been working on doing some pilot studies that will then end up as clinical. Actually, we're going to be doing a clinical trial with Ehlers-Danlos, so that will be really quite interesting. Using acoustic stimulation as an acoustic vagal nerve stimulator. So it's the idea of using prosodic vocalizations that have been computer altered and using that now to trigger the physiology to say everything is safe. And this is really a modification of an intervention I developed that's called the Safe and Sound Protocol, which is really hypermodulation of vocal intonation. So it takes vocal music, computer alters it to, in a sense, amplify the frequency shifts. And that basically is amplified trigger of safety. And then we see where that goes. So if the person, in a sense, accommodates that, they retune their autonomic nervous system. If it's a trigger of violation of trust, then the protocol has to be modified to allow the nervous system to resolve. Basically, the protocol has to be slowed up.
Thank you. And I'd love to be able to link to your Safe and Sound protocol when we share the recording for this so people can learn more about it.
Thank you.
Does this extend to autoimmune conditions as well, Stephen?
I don't know. I think that's a real interesting question, because if you start looking at the population who have autoimmune, they overlap with what are called medically unexplained symptoms. So it's like irritable bowel, dysautonomia, fibromyalgia, migraine. So from a polyvagal perspective, I would say that the autoimmune is really just another reflection of the feedback loops of homeostatic function being challenged. Another way of seeing polyvagal theory, it says that when you're safe, homeostatic function works. And when you want to define a stress response, you have to interpret it as a disruption of homeostatic function, which means rhythms or neurochemical or neuroautonomic. And so it's a different perspective how to look at things, as opposed to thinking of a deficit in a specific subsystem or organ. It's saying the entire network of neural regulation is shifting from supporting health, growth, and restoration to defense.
Thank you. So someone just asked what the VU is, and I think this is an interesting one because you know the VU, of course, from Peter. And what it's actually doing. But I wanted to say, Resma, who was on yesterday, he was also talking about some resources that we've had as humans forever, haven't we?
Yeah.
This humming, singing, as you mentioned earlier, different ways that we might stimulate the ventral vagal. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Well, let's start with directly answering the question. So the vibratory, making the VU sound, is stimulating many of the sensations within the oral motor cavity. And this, of course, the production and the sensation of this overlaps with pranayama yoga. And if we deconstruct pranayama yoga and say it's really a method of exercising the social engagement system, the VU becomes part of that. And when we exercise the social engagement system, whether it's a VU, playing the clarinet, or chanting, there's going to be differential efficiencies of these different methods, but they're all going to calm us down by increasing vagal activity on the heart and downregulating sympathetic activity and downregulating inflammation as well.
Thank you. So there's lots and lots of questions, and I don't want people to miss an opportunity. So would anyone else like to ask a question of Stephen who has their hand raised? There's a lot of questions in the chat box too, Mickey. What do you think? Somebody else want to raise? What's that?
I'm to unmute Heidi.
Okay. Hi, Heidi. Heidi, are you there? Heidi? Okay.
Move on to Yasmin.
Hi, Yasmin.
Hi. So I work with women who've been sexually abused. Mostly, this is the main population I'm working with. So it's really sometimes it's triggering for me. I'm a woman from Egypt, and sexual harassment is just everyday problem. So how to maintain my grounding and feel grounded for my clients while the session is running?
Well, what you're asking is what resource do you have to present this positive social engagement system when your clients are really have a flat face or in pain, and your nervous system, your neuroception is responding to that. And first of all, we are all human. Let's just stand back and say it's part of who we are to respond to that and want to either to be helpful or to help them on that. So understand your own vulnerability. You have to think now in terms of your own personal resources and tools for that resource. And that may be breathing. It may be an awareness that your body is going into a certain state. It may be requesting that you and your client break direct face-to-face. It may be a requirement that you get up and get a glass of water and you now engage by offering your client something that enables your body. Like, the issue is probably the most beneficial one would be some type of movement for you. So this becomes part of this whole issue, because you can't just, I'm now going to take some deep breaths, although you might say to your client, let's do a little breathing together. You also might say, let's get up and move a little bit. I can see that your body is becoming a little bit rigid. I want you to relax a little bit. Let's get up and let's do that. So the issue is understanding that when the body goes into defense, and that's where your body was going, it needs to move or to downregulate the defense. So your body is now prepared for mobilization. You might need to move, but you also, as you move, you now take a few of those breaths and you become aware of a settling occurring. I think it's a very tough task. I think, dealing with survivors of trauma, they're broadcasting to you their physiological state. And if you reflect that to them, they're devastated, because the thing they do not want to do is hurt you. And we forget about that. And that's why they're so hesitant to divulge and tell their story, because they don't want empathy. They don't want you to share their pain. So the exercise that we have to get into is an exercise of compassion, of witnessing. But that's a very difficult state to be in. And so what I'm saying to you is respect what your body's telling you. Don't get angry at yourself for feeling that way, but also understand when your body tells you that, there are things you can do. Movement will be the first one. A slight disruption in the sequencing, getting a glass of water, getting a glass of tea, something, or some breathing. And especially after the client, try some breathing and movement.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So there are a lot of other questions in here. Would someone had mentioned ADHD. Let me just say ADHD in children. There's no specific question, just interested in learning about ADHD in children.
So let me kind of respond to that. Obviously, children with ADHD have a challenged social engagement system. Okay, that's part of the features, the hypervigilance, often auditory hypersensitivity, and difficulty in state regulation, and now you defined it. So initially I said, well, it means that they're autonomic nervous system is literally retuned to states of defense. What I didn't acknowledge initially was that many children with ADHD symptomatology have a trauma history. And that comes out from the ACE literature. And I was literally saying, wow, it's not, I was really giving it credit to something simpler, like perhaps early developmental health issues, difficult deliveries, or I didn't see it as really being a direct consequence of identifiable traumatic events. And the literature suggests that there's probably a trauma history. Now, this doesn't mean that the trauma that the child experienced was a intentional trauma. This is what we have to always understand, is that the nervous system may react in states of life threat, and that really, for me, defines trauma. It's not the event, it's whether the individual responded with a life threat response. Now, if you have a life threat response, that's shutting down. That's going into the pits of despair. The mobilization is a way of staying out of that. So you find out with many trauma survivors, they do high-risk behaviors to highly mobilize. They appear to have high levels of anxiety. Physiologically, this is the adaptive strategy of the body not to go into a shutting down response. So let's even speculate about some children who may have had some emergency medical procedures, were held down, anesthetized, and the body went into this state. Then it's possible that the symptoms that then evolve from that may have features of hyperactivity.
Yeah. And even so, anxiety around slowing down because they might go into this shutting down state.
Right. So we have to, we see people that in a sense are chronically doing things to they're trying to regulate, they're desperately and valiantly trying to regulate their physiological state. And we say, we don't like it, stop doing that. Stop fidgeting. What is the fidgeting telling us? It's telling us that their body needs to do those behaviors to regulate. Now, why is it doing that? Because it can't find a safe state. And so we have to start asking the question, what types of people mobilize, and what is the motivation to mobilize? The motivation in the body to mobilize is to keep the body out of shutting down. So when you start probing people who have high anxiety symptomatology, I mean, really probing with getting a real good clinical history, you often find something happened that in their childhood or something happened where they felt that their life was under threat, and then retuned. And even discussing that and allowing that to come out can potentially have a healing potential.
Thank you, Stephen. We only have a few more minutes, and I want to be able to give a few more people, or maybe one or two more questions. Stephen, what do you think?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yes, of course.
One or two more questions. Mickey, is there somebody who has their hand raised that would like to ask a question of Stephen?
Let me unmute Tiffany. You're unmuted.
Hi, Dr. Porges. My question is about having a nervous system that has been dysregulated by taking psychiatric drugs and also withdrawing from them, particularly withdrawing too fast from them, and having a destabilized nervous system because of that. So it might complicate things because there's kind of like a chemical, the chemical assault on the body.
Okay, so you want me to give you a strategy or an explanation? I would, first of all, in your own personal perspective, see your nervous system in an optimistic light, that it will start to find its own balance as long as you and your environment support it. So in this case, part of the support is an understanding. It's understanding that destabilization is the first step in stabilizing. So you have to become comfortable with who you are and allow your body to do its job. Part of and this is a philosophical question for all of us, in this Western society that we live in. We think that if something is wrong on a mental level, there's a pill, or they will find a pill to cure it, when in many cases the mental issues are really emergent properties of a biological state, often related to our body being in states of defense. So if the underlying causal features are being in states of defense, then our treatment strategy should be to send cues to our nervous system to be in states of safety. And that takes time, especially if it's been primed with experience and with medication. So let's take this optimistic perspective and say there's wisdom in the body, and the body will, in a sense, start to reorganize, but it may take time. Okay.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So even the cause prior to taking the medication.
Well, give me, so what was, so can you share that, the cause? Or
Sure. Well, for me personally, it was depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
And then I'm realizing that taking the medication has just further complicated everything.
So Tiffany, if you think about depression and anxiety as the body trying, one, to mobilize in defense, and then shifting from that into an immobilization defense, but not being regulated through a social engagement or a safety network, the reactions are very predictable, that your body, your autonomic nervous system wasn't getting the cues to organize in a more homeostatic way, and the drugs were targeted really at higher brain structures involved in what the pharmaceutical trade thinks is really what anxiety and depression are. And what polyvagal theory is saying, that underneath those psychiatric terms is really an autonomic nervous system that is really attempting to save your life. And it needs to be acknowledged, is what I'm really saying. You need to acknowledge the wisdom of your body in what it's doing for you, and allow it to express and to reorganize.
Okay. So then just, yeah.
Well, the final comment is that as with all these issues regarding trauma and reorganization, I will use the metaphor, don't try this at home alone. So it requires, a sensitive and aware therapist to be the navigator. So to enable you to, in a sense, respect what your body is doing, and then allowing it to resolve, or allowing you to allow it to resolve.
Stephen, thank you so much. I think one of the things I love about the polyvagal theory so much, and it's an invitation to all of us to understand what you were saying about the wisdom and the intelligence of our bodies, which is such a gorgeous invitation to come out of this shame and this very toxic shame experience many of us live with when it comes to our behavior, our responses.
Well, think for a moment about all our institutions, whether we talk about schools or religious structures or government structures, they're all evaluative. And our body evaluation is to our nervous system, it's life threat at times, and it's always danger. So at a point in time, our nervous system is saying, give up that, allow it to be what it is, respect it, love it, and let's see what it becomes.
And that's the safety we provide ourselves, isn't it?
Well, or we try to, right?
We try to, yes.
but we acknowledge that it's a difficult task, and it's a journey, and so we don't get angry when we're not there today or yesterday or tomorrow.
Yes, please, absolutely. Loving kindness practices, those are also quite powerful though when it comes to providing that sort of that relationship to self, that safe contact.
Exactly.
So everybody, I want to thank you so much. I think we have to let Stephen go now because we're a little over the hour already. Stephen, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that this probably didn't answer everyone's question, and it couldn't possibly in an hour. There's so much to learn, but of course we'd love to share with everybody who's tuning in where they can learn more about you. Where would you like to send them? Where's the best place?
They can go to my webpage, which is stephenporges.com, and that should be linked to other things, including YouTube's and some articles. So they're very welcome to visit me there.
Great, and we'll make sure we send that in the email too tomorrow. Thank you so much, Dr. Porges. I appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again.
I hope so. Nice to see you again. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
For all those who are still here and who want to go into the coffee break, you're welcome to do that. And Mickey, I think, how many people do we have? Can we do the coffee breaks?
Yes, we can. I will
And just,
be
oh,
sending
sorry.
people into the rooms as soon as you're ready.
Okay, and just so everybody knows, the next session coming up is going to be with Paul Linden, and that's going to be hosted by a woman named Stephanie Danny. And then later tonight will be Albert Wong. So be sure to come back if you're interested in either of those two talks. You can check those out on the schedule to see what they're talking about. And otherwise, thank you for being here, guys. Oh, did you put the breakout rooms up already, Mickey?
Just about to. And
Okay, wait, before you do, maybe just let people know how much time they have.
already, so you'll have 10 minutes in the room, 10-15 minutes. And I'll pop in and give you a 60-second warning before they close.
So you have 10-15 minutes in the room, and the coffee break. It's just an opportunity to connect with one another and have a chat about Stephen's session, maybe exchange what you shared about. It's totally optional, so you don't have to join. And then it will just close down. You won't be coming back into this main room. So you'll just close down from the coffee break. So if you want to do that, then you can click on the link when it pops up.